Hello, welcome to RC Video Reviews. In today's video, we're going to dial it back a little bit and we're just going to cover some basics. Flaps. One of the big questions I see continuously on EdgeTX is how do I set up flaps? So we're going to just dial it back a little bit and do a couple of quick little examples on how you can get flaps working on your model with EdgeTX. Before we get started, I want to show you the little RCVR 2 model that I'll be using. These are available in my Etsy store. Links in the description if you'd like to get one for yourself. 15 bucks and it's board only. You have to provide your own hardware. But I'll also have a link for the servos and the hardware that I used in my kit. I have the little RCVR 2 connected to an Express LRS radio module, and that's being powered by a benchtop power supply. So right now I've got my radio and my model configured to work together. So you can see I've got aileron and a little bit of elevator back there, and we'll even get the flaps moving. That's what we're here to see. Notice in this particular arrangement where the servo horns are for the flaps. I've got my port flap with the servo arm inboard, so the screw is close to the fuselage, not outboard. On this side, I've got my starboard flap, and that screw is also inboard. And so what that means is that these two servos will always work in the opposite direction from each other. As I move my stick, if I send the same pulse width signal to both servos, they're both going to turn in a counterclockwise or clockwise manner. And what that means when the servo arms are facing each other or inboard is that one will work opposite the other. If you want your servos to work in the same direction with the same signal, then what you need to do is have your second servo screw lined up with the first one. So if this were my other flap servo, say my second flap servo, this horn would have to be on the same side of the servo as this one. So if I took this servo and moved it over to this side, then they would both go in the same direction with the same pulse width. But because the servos are opposing each other, and I have one inboard on this side and one inboard on this side, that means I have to reverse the signal to one of the servos. So in other words, you can't use a Y cable with this configuration. You have to use two different channels. That's the way my hardware is set up. Fortunately, a lot of planes either come with an inbuilt mixer. So if you have flaps, they have a mixer sometimes where they'll mix the servo correctly for you, or they line the servos up and install them on the model so that both your horns are lined up in the same direction. I just wanted to point that out in the beginning because you're going to see that configuration difference as we go through the radio setup on EdgeTX. But first, for you electronics gurus and tinkerers out there, check out PCBWay.com. PCBWay has a full suite of services available to make your ideas a reality, including PCB manufacturing and assembly, CNC machining, 3D printing, and injection molding. When you're ready to order, PCBWay provides instant quotes, real-time production tracking, and you can order as few as 5 boards at a time, which is great for early-stage projects. If you need an experienced partner to help bring your ideas to life, check out PCBWay.com. I have a link in the description if you'd like to give them a look. With that out of the way, let's get into the most simple flap setup I can show you. I'll click my model button and move over to my mixer page, and I'm going to scroll down and show you that I have my flaps set up on channels 6 and 7. Notice that the weight on channel 6 is -100 and the weight on channel 7 is 100. The reason for that is because I have two horns inboard. They're not going in the same direction. That's why I inverted the weight on one of them. And by doing that, that gets my flaps moving in the same direction. So when I move my switch down, both flaps go down. When I move my switch up, both flaps go up. Let's take a look at the configuration on the radio so you can see what it looks like. In the name field, I used P flap, that stands for port flap, and I have the source SB. And you can use any switch or slider you want. I'll show you a slider configuration in a little while. For now, we're just going to stick with a switch, and I'm using SB. So you can click on the source button, and then all you have to do is move a switch. So if you wanted it to be SA, you just have to move it. That's all you have to do. If you want it to be SB, just move that one. So we'll pick SB. The reason I'm using a weight of -100 is because I have those opposing horns. So I'll show you that by pushing SB up, and you can see both the flaps are now up. If I invert this weight of -100, if I were to go in and invert that, then what that'll do is move one of them. It'll be the port flap. So I'll hit the invert button, and you can see the port flap just went down. So now with both weights at a positive value, you can see the issue with the servo horns that I talked about earlier. Both weights are positive, and as I move my switch to the down position, the flaps move opposite of each other. So the way you cure that is just go into the flap channel of the one that's operating backwards from what you expect and invert the weight. So I'll click Edit, I'll click on my weight, and I'll just click the invert button. Now both of my flaps are down when my switch is down. I could also invert it the other way. So let's do that. I'm going to invert it back, and we'll go into the starboard flap now, and I'm going to invert that one. So I'm just going to click Edit, go into my weight, click Invert. Now what happens is when my switch is in the down position, my flaps are up. This is all personal preference. There's no wrong answer here. It's what you want on your radio. In my case, I like flaps to be down when the switch is down. You might like your flaps to be up when the switch is down. It's up to you. So in this case now, if I move my switch to the middle position, my flaps go halfway down. And if I move it all the way up, they go all the way down. That's one way to do it. I can also reverse this whole process by using outputs as well. Let's take a look at that. I'll back out of the mix, and we're gonna go into the output tab. And in the output tab, I'm gonna go down to channels 6 and 7, and I'm gonna invert them both. I'll click on 6, click Edit, and I'm just gonna click this invert button. There we go. And now I'll go on to 7, we'll edit it, and I'm gonna click the invert button. Now notice both my flaps are up and my switch is up. See, there's lots of different ways you can do things. It really kind of depends on what works for you. There's not necessarily a wrong answer when it comes to setting which direction your controls move, as long as you keep in mind that you want things to be symmetrical. In most cases, sometimes you might not. So now I'll move my SB switch to the down position, and you can see my flaps are moving up and down. Now, I'm going to go back to the mixer because one of the areas that I see a constant problem is that people put in these crazy configurations where they put 3 or 4 mix lines in. You don't need that. Notice for channel 6, I have one single line. It says channel 6 has a weight of 100, the switch is SB, and the label is P flap. That's it. That's all you need to do to install flaps on your model. That's it. Also notice when I move my switch, check the monitor out. When I move the switch to the middle position, I'm at 0. And when I move it to the down position, I'm all the way over here at negative 100. So all that shows you is the mix line will recognize the switch position and send the signal out accordingly. You do not need 3 lines. You don't need 3 switch configurations. Just one switch configuration per channel. In my case, my flaps are on 2 different channels, so I have 2 switch configurations. I'm using channel 6 and channel 7. Now, if all you wanted was the most basic flap setup, you've got it. If you'd like to learn a little bit more, hang around. I'm going to show you some advanced concepts that'll make your flap setup a little bit more realistic and probably a little more practical on your plane. The first thing we'll cover is converting your flap switch to an input instead of a switch on the mixer. Let me show you why we do that. If I go into my inputs page and I scroll down, you'll see that I already have a flap definition using my right slider, which is over here on the right-hand side. So I've got flap negative 100 right slider. So I already have an input defined. I'll bring up the edit box so you can take a look at it. Flap, source is right slider, and the weight on this one is negative 100. I don't know if the negative 100 is right or not. We'll find out, and if it's not, we'll fix it. That's what you really want to understand, is how to correct it if it's not quite right. So my input is already set. Now I'm going to go back to my mixer, and I'm going to go to channel 6, and I'm going to change that source. Instead of using a switch, I'm going to use my input. So we will scroll to inputs, and I'll select flap. That's already defined. Now I'll escape out of channel 6, and I'm going to do the same thing on channel 7. We'll go to source, and we'll select input and flap. Now I've got my input defining the physical switch that controls my flaps. So now if I move my right slider, which is right here, that now controls my flaps. And it just so happens they're working in the correct direction, because when my slider is all the way up, I want the flaps up. When my slider is midway, I want the flaps midway. And when the slider is all the way down, I want the flaps fully deployed. Now, if you want them reversed, there's a couple of different ways you can do that. And here's one of the reasons it's fun to use the inputs for this. So let's just say, for argument's sake, you want to reverse that scenario. We'll back out of here, go to the inputs page, and I'm just going to go down to my flaps, and notice how I have negative 100 for the value. All I have to do is invert that. If I just click on that field and hit invert, now my flaps are inverted from the switch position I just had. Notice the right slider is all the way down, but the flaps are up. If I move the slider to the mid position, they're still halfway down, but if I push the slider all the way up, the flaps are fully deployed. So that's one reason you might want to use inputs, and that's because you can manipulate your flaps with one setting instead of 2 in your mixer and 2 in your output. Make sense? Another reason you might want to use inputs is because what happens if you decide to change the control that operates the flaps? If you use an input, you can easily do that by clicking on the source button and selecting another switch, let's say SB. So if I click the SB switch and just move it, I can select that. Now the SB switch controls both my flaps. So rather than changing the configuration on 2 lines in the mixer, you can change it in one place on inputs. That's another reason you might want to use inputs. I've got 2 more things I want to show you for advanced flap configuration. The first one is how you can slow your flap deployment down. A lot of times when you put flaps down, it's going to change the flight characteristics of the plane. It might cause the nose to pitch up, it might cause it to pitch down. It kind of depends on your plane. One way you can help settle that behavior down is by deploying flaps slowly. And on full-size aircraft, that's exactly what we do. We do not just slam the flaps down. They come down kind of slow. And the reason for that is because you don't want a jerky movement by the airplane. So we'll go into channel 6 on the mixer page, and I'll click this and hit the little gear icon down here at the bottom. And under the gear icon, there's an option in here called slow up and slow down. So if I increase that, say to 2 seconds, and then the slow down also to 2 seconds, we have to do that on both channels, 6 and 7. Don't do it on just one. You got to do it on both. So we'll edit number 7 as well. We'll hit the gear icon. We'll do slow up and slow down for 2 seconds. Now what happens is when we move our switch, the movement of the flaps will slow. So I'm going to bring the flaps up and see how slow that's moving. We'll do it again, bring them up, and now they're moving slow. That gives your model a little bit of time to react to the movement of your flaps and the change in the aerodynamic properties of your wing. The last advanced topic I want to show you are curves. Sometimes you might want to control where those flaps are in the mid and down position. One real easy way to do that is with the use of curves. I'm still on channel 7. I've already got a curve defined, so I'm going to show you that curve, and I'll show you how to edit it. On the curve button in the mixer, I'm going to select my curve by scrolling up, and my curve is named FLP for flap. Now, if I select that curve and then long press it, Edge brings me to an edit screen where I can change the parameters of this curve. I've got my flaps assigned to SB, and the only one that I applied the curve on is the starboard flap. So watch what happens. Watch how they behave differently. When I put the switch in the middle position, that's the middle flap position, or takeoff flaps, some might call it. Notice how much lower the port flap is than the starboard flap. That's because of the curve. Now I'm going to bring the flaps all the way down. And you can see they both look like they're in about the same spot, also because of the curve. Now let's take a look at the curve and see what's going on here. I've got a curve value of -100, -41, and 100. So when I'm in the up position, I'm at -100. If I wanted to change that parked position, I could simply go down to this -100 field and manipulate this number. I can bring it all the way up to 100. And when I do that, you can see what's happening to the only flap that had the curve applied. It moved. Now you might be asking yourself, why do you need to worry about the first position? Well, what if you need to change the way they park? Let's say you have split flaps and your servos are grinding a little bit at the top. You can use a curve to control that. Or if you just have regular flaps like these and you get to the field and realize, hey, my flaps are riding a little proud of the wing, you can come in and use a curve to adjust both flaps at the same time. So I'll scroll this value back down, and we should see the starboard flap come back up to the resting position. And let's say that I want this to be my new resting position, -83. I like the way that looks better. We just park it there. Okay, so that's the first position. That's kind of like the parked or stowed position for your flaps. The next field is what I would call your takeoff flaps or your mid flaps. You can control the amount of deflection by manipulating this number, and that'll change the value for both flaps once we apply the curve to the second flap. Okay, so I'm going to go into the second field, and I'm going to put my switch in the middle position so I can see what's happening with the flap. I've got -41 at a value, but let's say I want them to be down quite a bit further for the mid flaps. All I have to do is raise this value. So as I bring this middle value up, see how that flap goes farther down, and we can even bring it all the way to the full deployed position if we want. That's not much of a curve. You'd only have a 2-position flap down and up, but you could do it if you wanted. So let's say for this example, I only want it to be about 15 degrees for takeoff. I can use this middle dot and watch this flap come up. It's going to come up to my visual spot where I think I want it to be for takeoff. You see it moving there? Now it's almost at 0. We're getting there. And I've got a value of -34. So that's a very small flap deployment. And again, once you apply the curve to both flaps, they'll both behave the same way. Now let's say for the final position, full deflection, I don't want them to go all the way down at like a full, 80 degrees. Maybe that's a little too much for this plane. We'll go into the third position. We'll bring our switch all the way down. That's fully deployed. And now we can manipulate the travel distance of the fully deployed position. So I'll click on this value and I'm going to scroll left and watch the flap come up. See how the flap is moving up toward the wing? All right, that's a value of 13. So if you just want a really low weight for your flaps, that's how you can do it for both of them. So I've got -83, -34, and 16. And now when I move my flaps to the mid position, you can see we've got a very mild takeoff flap. And if I move it to the full deployed position, we've got a very mild landing flap as well. The last thing to do is to apply this curve to the other flap as well. So we do that by backing out of the curve editor. Just press the return button until you get back to your mix page, and then we'll press it one more time. And now we're going to go to channel 6 and edit that one, and we're going to apply this curve here as well. So we're going to apply the flap curve, and now the port flap will behave exactly the same way as the starboard flap. So when I bring the flap to the mid position, you can see they're both at that very mild setting for takeoff. And when I bring them to the store position, they're stored. And when I bring them all the way down, they're in that mild position that we set up in our curve. Okay, in this video, I showed you how to set up a very basic flap configuration with one switch and 2 mix lines. That's as basic as it gets. In that configuration, your servos will move halfway at 1500 microseconds, which is 0 on EdgeTX, and they'll move to full deployment at 2012 microseconds, which is 100% on EdgeTX. Then I showed you how to use inputs and to reassign your control just by changing the control and the inputs. Then we showed you how to slow down your flap deployment so while you're flying, the flaps don't have such a magnified impact on the model when you deploy them. And then finally, we talked about curves, and I showed you how to edit a curve and apply it to both flaps so you can change the travel distance for your flaps on your radio. That covers just about everything I know regarding flaps on EdgeTX. I hope you found the video useful, and if you did, smash that thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell so you know when new videos hit the channel. That's all I've got for today. Take it easy and go fly something.